Hey.
But before that incident?
Nope.
Evil does not always appear with warning signs. It does not always grow from trauma or emerge from the chaos of broken families. Sometimes, it arrives quietly, in infancy, in childhood, in the earliest years of a life that will one day devour the lives of others. Tonight, we step into a world where darkness seems woven into the very foundations of certain individuals. A darkness so deep, so complete, that investigators and psychologists still argue over the same question. Can someone be born evil? When we look at the lives of history's most infamous killers, patterns often emerge: hardship, abuse, violence, instability. But not always. Some of the most terrifying offenders showed signs long before their world fell apart, long before circumstance could be blamed. Their behaviors appeared unprovoked, instinctive, and disturbingly natural. These are the cases that fracture the usual explanations. Children who harmed animals without flinching. Teenagers who spoke about death with fascination rather than fear. Young adults who formed no emotional bonds, no empathy, no remorse. People who drifted through life with a disturbing sense of detachment, as though they were watching humanity from the outside rather than living within it. And when they began to act, when the violence finally surfaced, it felt less like a transformation and more like a revealing of what had been there all along. This documentary is not about understanding killers through pity or excuse. It is about confronting the terrifying reality that some individuals seem to carry the seeds of destruction from the very beginning, long before their first crime, long before their first arrest, long before anyone realizes what they truly are. You will hear about men who murdered as children, men who smiled through interrogations, men who planned human suffering with the same calm precision others use to plan daily routines, men whose victims ranged from strangers on the street to the people they grew up with under the same roof. You will hear about killers who found pleasure in cruelty, killers who displayed warning signs that were ignored, killers whose emotional emptiness was so complete that specialists still debate whether empathy ever existed within them at all. These are not stories of momentary rage, not crimes of passion, not the desperate acts of people pushed to the edge. These are the stories of individuals whose darkness was present long before the world ever knew their names. Individuals whose crimes were the natural extension of lives, already twisted by something deep, internal, and terrifyingly innate. These men are not monsters created by circumstance. They are monsters who seem to carry their nature from the very start, growing into it, stepping into it, embracing it. This is not the tale of what turned them evil. This is the tale of those who may have been born that way. Tonight, we examine 10 of the most chilling killers whose actions, histories, and psychological profiles force us to confront a question humanity is never comfortable asking. What if some people are born without the ability to care, to feel, or to choose anything other than the darkness within them? March of 1972, Santa Cruz, California. A fog settles over the coastline as streetlights flicker in the early morning haze. Students move across the quiet campus of Cabrillo College, unaware that a man is driving slowly through the parking lots, watching, studying, waiting. That man is Edmund Kemper III. To understand the darkness that followed him into adulthood, we have to step further back, long before the fog, long before the murders, long before California even knew his name. Kemper's story begins in the 1940s, inside a fractured household where his mother and father clashed constantly. As a child, Edmund was tall, unusually tall, and his size made him appear older than he really was. But beneath the physical presence lived something quieter, colder, unresolved. From early childhood, Kemper displayed warning signs that terrified those closest to him. He decapitated his sister's dolls, he performed mock executions, he isolated himself from other children, and he showed a fascination with death that no one understood. He killed animals, not out of fear or impulse, but out of something deeper. Something he later described not as rage, but curiosity. A desire to feel the moment where life slipped away. It was an early glimpse into a mind shaped not by sudden trauma, but by something forming from within. Kemper's relationship with his mother, Clarnell, was explosive. She was controlling, unpredictable, and often cruel. She locked him in the basement at night. She belittled him for his size. She told him repeatedly that no woman would ever want him. And still, even this does not fully explain the darkness already growing inside him. When Kemper reached 14, he committed his first double murder, his grandparents. He shot his grandmother after an argument, then waited for his grandfather to return home, and killed him too. When questioned, he explained calmly that he just wanted to see what it felt like. No remorse, no panic, just an emotional void. He was sent to Atascadero State Hospital, where psychiatrists discovered something chilling. Kemper had an unusually high intelligence. He understood psychological tests so well that he manipulated them. He learned exactly what doctors wanted to hear. He studied abnormal psychology books. He memorized diagnostic criteria. He behaved like a model patient until they believed he was safe. At age 21, Edmund Kemper, a boy who had already murdered twice, walked out of a psychiatric hospital with a clean slate. The darkness simply waited. He moved back in with his mother. The tension between them grew sharper, heavier, more volatile. Kemper roamed Santa Cruz County, picking up hitchhikers. At first, he claimed he only wanted company, but he later admitted he was rehearsing, practicing, planning his approach. When he finally killed again, the years of internal rehearsal became real. He targeted young female students. He picked them up in his car. He drove them to remote areas, and there, away from the safety of campus, he took full control. Kemper murdered with a calmness that stunned investigators. He dismembered bodies, kept trophies, and returned to crime scenes with a sense of ownership. He spoke later about possession, describing how he wanted his victims with him even after death. These were not impulsive killings. They were expressions of fantasies he had nurtured since childhood. Yet to the outside world, Edmund Kemper remained invisible. He drank at local bars. He chatted with police officers. He visited the same investigators working the case. They knew him as Big Ed, the friendly giant. No one suspected the truth, but there was one relationship that overshadowed them all: his mother. Clarnell became the fixation, the symbol, the emotional center of his rage. Every insult, every rejection, every moment she made him feel small, simmered inside him. The murders of young women were rehearsals for the final act he had been building toward for years. In April of 1973, that act arrived. Kemper murdered his mother in her bedroom. The scene was brutal, intimate, and deeply symbolic, the culmination of decades of resentment. Afterward, he killed her close friend, and then, as if the storm inside him had finally burned itself out, he drove east, leaving Santa Cruz behind. In Colorado, he called police. He confessed. He explained everything with precision and detail, not out of guilt, but because, in his words, he had no more reason to continue. Investigators were stunned by his intelligence, his cooperation, and his emotional flatness. He spoke about his crimes like someone recounting a schedule, calm, steady, detached. He did not tremble. He did not cry. He did not break. Psychologists studying Kemper found traits present long before the murders: early cruelty, emotional detachment, violent fantasies, manipulative intelligence. These were not created in adulthood. They were present from the beginning, signs of a mind shaped by something far more intrinsic than environment alone. Kemper was sentenced to life in prison, where he remains today. Articulate, polite, and chillingly self-aware. A man who can describe his own violence with the same tone another might use to describe a routine day. And as the steel door closes on Edmund Kemper, we move from the quiet streets of Santa Cruz to a bleak, snow-covered corner of the Soviet Union, where another child grew into a man consumed by impulses even darker. This is Andrei Chikatilo, October of 1978, Rostov Oblast, Soviet Union. A thin layer of frost coats the fields as evening settles in. Children walk home in small clusters, their breath rising in the cold air. The roads are quiet, the factories hum in the distance, and somewhere along a wooded path near the riverbank, a man waits in the shadows. That man is Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo. To understand how he became one of the most feared killers in Soviet history, we have to step back decades, back to the 1930s and 1940s, to a childhood shaped by famine, fear, and a hollow kind of loneliness that he carried into adulthood. Chikatilo was born during a period of brutal scarcity. Stories circulated through the villages. Stories of starvation, of desperation, of neighbors turning on neighbors. Whether every story was true or exaggerated over time hardly mattered. The environment that shaped him was one of survival, suspicion, and silence. As a child, he struggled physically and socially. He was shy, withdrawn, and often mocked by classmates. He suffered from chronic bedwetting well into adolescence, a symptom that filled him with shame and deepened his isolation. He avoided eye contact. He spoke softly. He had no meaningful friendships. But beneath the timid exterior lived something far more troubling. Chikatilo began experiencing violent fantasies at a young age, fantasies he hid from everyone. He fixated on power, on domination, on the idea of holding control over someone weaker. These thoughts did not appear suddenly. They grew slowly, quietly, like roots spreading deep beneath the soil. By adulthood, Chikatilo attempted to build a normal life. He worked various jobs. He got married. He had children. But even then, the emptiness inside him remained. He struggled with intimacy. He struggled with identity. He struggled with impulses he did not know how to control. His frustration became a constant companion, one he carried into every part of his life. In the late 1970s, Chikatilo became a school teacher. Parents did not know that the quiet man in the classroom was already slipping into predatory behavior. He touched students inappropriately, watched them with unsettling attention, and sought moments of isolation. Complaints surfaced, but the Soviet system, rigid, secretive, eager to avoid scandal, handled these incidents quietly. He was reassigned, dismissed, but never fully confronted. Those missed warnings would prove catastrophic. By 1978, the fantasies he had carried for decades became too powerful to contain. In a small wooded area near a riverbank, Chikatilo attacked and murdered a young girl named Yelena Zakotnova. The violence was shocking, frenzied, and deeply personal. And when it was over, he felt a sense of release he later described in the chilling detail. This was his first known murder. But it was not the last. Chikatilo realized something that night, something that would shape the next 12 years of terror. He discovered that the violence quieted the turmoil inside him. It became a pattern, a need, a compulsion. He began seeking victims in train stations, bus stops, markets, and forest paths. Many were children, some were teenagers, others were vulnerable adults. He lured them with promises of food, money, or assistance. He walked with them into the woods. And once they were alone, the brutality began. Forensic investigators later found similar patterns across many victims: stabbing, mutilation, and extreme violence. The injuries were consistent, deliberate, and deeply disturbing. This was not impulsive rage. This was ritual. But solving the case was nearly impossible. The Soviet Union, in the 1980s, refused to publicly acknowledge the existence of a serial killer. The idea was politically unacceptable. Investigators faced limited resources, restricted information, and bureaucratic pressure. Wrongful arrests occurred. Innocent men were blamed. One man even took his own life after being accused. Meanwhile, Chikatilo moved freely across regions, shifting jobs, blending into crowds, hunting quietly in the spaces between villages and cities. His crimes continued, year after year, body after body, each one discovered in silence and confusion. It wasn't until 1990 that investigators finally caught him. A detective monitoring a train station noticed his strange behavior, circling young people, approaching strangers, watching them too closely. Suspicion grew, surveillance followed, and Chikatilo was eventually detained. During questioning, the timid schoolteacher facade cracked. He began to confess. In long, chilling monologues, he described his crimes in detail. He reenacted attacks for investigators. He explained his impulses with a disturbing calmness, as though describing routine events rather than atrocities. Psychologists studying him found markers present long before adulthood: severe social detachment, lack of empathy, violent fantasies, sexual deviance, and emotional emptiness. These were not traits created by stress or sudden break. They were lifelong. At trial, Chikatilo's behavior was erratic, shouting, mumbling, convulsing, arguing. But beneath the theatrics, he understood perfectly what he had done. The court found him guilty. He was executed in 1994. His story remains a devastating reminder that darkness does not always emerge from a single moment. Sometimes it is carried quietly through childhood, waiting for the opportunity to flourish. And as the snow settles again over Rostov, one truth becomes clear. Some predators hide in fear, while others hide in charm. From the timid schoolteacher in the Soviet Union, we move now to a man whose smile became his first weapon, and whose charisma concealed a far darker intent. January of 1974, Seattle, Washington. A cold fog settles between the pine trees that border the university district. Students hurry across wet sidewalks, their conversations drifting softly into the night air. Posters for missing young women cling to bulletin boards, edges, curled by rain. Few know it yet, but the city is standing at the edge of a storm it cannot see. Somewhere in the darkness, watching quietly from behind a windshield, sits a man with an arm in a fake cast, and a smile he has practiced for years. His name is Theodore Robert Bundy. To understand how he became one of the most infamous killers in American history, we must return to the beginning, to a childhood wrapped in secrets. Bundy was born in the mid-1940s, under circumstances that were hidden from him. He was raised as though his grandparents were his parents and his mother was his sister. For many, this confusion would become a source of identity conflict. For Bundy, it created something deeper, an early sense that the world operated in shadows and lies, and that he was expected to move quietly among them. Even as a boy, Bundy was different. He was intelligent but detached, polite yet emotionless. Observers later recalled that he watched people with a strange stillness, as though studying them from behind a pane of glass. He learned early how to mimic the behavior of others, how to copy charm, how to appear normal. It was not instinct, it was strategy. In adolescence, Bundy developed an obsession with control. He spent hours watching pedestrians through windows, memorizing their habits. He collected magazines and crime stories. He wandered neighborhoods at night, following strangers from a distance. These behaviors, revealed only years later, showed a quiet foundation forming beneath the polite exterior. A foundation built on power, secrecy, and fantasy. By adulthood, Bundy lived two separate lives. The public saw a confident student who studied psychology and later law, a young man active in political campaigns, a charismatic volunteer at a crisis hotline, a speaker with poise and ambition. But the private Bundy, the real Bundy, was drifting deeper into violent fantasies. He watched women closely, not with admiration, but with calculation. He imagined scenarios of control, domination, and possession. And slowly, these thoughts shaped the man he would become. In the early 1970s, young women began disappearing across Washington state. A student vanished on her walk home. A hitchhiker never reached her destination. A woman left her apartment and did not return. The cases seemed unrelated until patterns formed. The victims resembled one another. They were taken from public spaces. They vanished without struggle, and in the rare moments where survivors or witnesses caught a glimpse of the man behind the wheel, one detail emerged again and again. He was handsome, he was friendly, and he introduced himself as Ted. Bundy used simple tricks to gain trust. A fake cast, a dropped stack of books, a request for help loading a sailboat or carrying something to his car. His voice was warm, his smile disarming, his politeness rehearsed to perfection. And once a woman stepped close enough, he overpowered her with terrifying speed. His car, a Volkswagen Beetle, became his moving hunting ground. Inside it, he removed the passenger seat to make abduction easier. Investigators later called the vehicle one of the most chilling crime scenes in American history, not because of its appearance, but because of how ordinary it looked. As the disappearances increased, so did Bundy's confidence. He crossed state lines. He changed jurisdictions. He adapted to police strategies. He followed media coverage closely, adjusting his behavior as investigators closed in. When he moved to Utah, the violence followed. When he moved to Colorado, the pattern continued. Every state believed the killer was local, until the truth became impossible to ignore. Bundy's first arrest came after a routine traffic stop in the mid-1970s. Inside his car, police found handcuffs, rope, and tools that suggested far more than a simple misunderstanding. But Bundy smiled through every interview, every hearing, every courtroom appearance. He charmed attorneys, he impressed judges, he manipulated everyone around him, and then he escaped, twice. Once by slipping through a courthouse window, once by crawling through a hole in the ceiling of his jail cell after losing enough weight to fit. His final flight took him to Florida, where the attacks at the Chi Omega sorority house marked one of the most brutal escalations of his crimes. The speed, the violence, the recklessness, all revealed a predator whose sense of control had shattered. Yet even during his trial, Bundy transformed the courtroom into a stage. He represented himself. He cross-examined witnesses, he smiled at cameras, he performed. But performances cannot erase evidence. Witnesses identified him. Forensics tied him to multiple victims. His connections across states became undeniable. Bundy was sentenced to death. In prison, he continued manipulating the world outside his cell, granting interviews, offering confessions strategically, and delaying execution by revealing additional crimes. Even in his final days, his ego controlled every word he spoke. When Bundy was executed in 1989, crowds outside the prison cheered, but for investigators and psychologists, the story remained heavy with questions. His charm, his manipulation, his lifelong emotional emptiness, all pointed to traits present long before his first murder. Bundy was not simply a killer who snapped. He was a man whose darkness grew slowly, quietly, naturally. And when the final flashbulbs fade from Ted Bundy's last walk, another figure emerges from the edge of the highways. A towering man who invited young men into his home. But when they wanted to leave, their stay became forever.
I didn't know what to think about it. I suppose everyone has their secret thoughts.
July of 1991, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. A humid summer night hangs over the city like a heavy blanket. Neon signs flicker above quiet streets. A handful of cars roll through the intersections, their engines echoing off brick apartment buildings. And somewhere inside one of those buildings, behind a door that smells faintly of chemicals, a truth waits to be discovered. But Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer's story begins long before that night, long before the horror inside apartment number 213 came to light. We go back to the 1960s, to a quiet suburban home where a young boy played with toy soldiers and walked the woods behind his house with an odd sort of curiosity. From the beginning, Dahmer seemed different, withdrawn, quiet, watching the world instead of participating in it. By early adolescence, he began collecting dead animals, not out of fear or impulse, but with a fascination that unsettled even those who loved him. He stored bones, cleaned carcasses, and experimented with the remains. He later described it as an interest in what he called the biology of things. But beneath that explanation lay something darker, a growing comfort with lifelessness. As his parents' marriage dissolved, Dahmer's isolation deepened. He drank heavily, even in school. He drifted through hallways in a fog of loneliness and quiet despair. Classmates remembered him as strange but harmless, the boy who made jokes to hide the emptiness behind his eyes. But emptiness does not stay quiet forever. In the summer after his high school graduation, Dahmer committed his first murder. He picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. They drank, they talked, and when Hicks tried to leave, something inside Dahmer snapped. He struck him, he killed him. He dismembered the body. He later said he did it because he did not want Hicks to go. A confession that revealed the foundation of Dahmer's future crimes: fear of abandonment, a yearning for possession, and a desperate desire to control. For years after that, Dahmer drifted. He joined the army, but was discharged for alcohol abuse. He lived with relatives, but could not maintain stability. He worked simple jobs, but remained emotionally disconnected. The fantasies never stopped. They grew stronger, more detailed, more demanding. By the late 1980s, Dahmer moved into the Oxford Apartments in Milwaukee. And there, behind a locked door, his inner world became reality. He lured young men, often from vulnerable communities, back to his apartment with offers of money or photographs. Once inside, he drugged them, killed them, and attempted to keep them with him in ways that investigators would later describe as some of the most disturbing practices they had ever encountered. He photographed his victims. He kept skulls. He preserved bones. He stored remains in drawers, refrigerators, and chemical vats. He spoke later about wanting a sense of permanence, an unthinkable expression of control over bodies he treated not as people, but as objects that belonged to him. When police finally discovered what he had been hiding, the apartment became a scene that would haunt Milwaukee forever. Photos, tools, human remains, evidence of rituals no one could fully comprehend. But the most unsettling aspect of Jeffrey Dahmer was not the crime scene. It was his calmness. During interrogations, Dahmer spoke clearly, politely, and without hesitation. He walked detectives through every detail. He explained his motivations with a chilling emotional detachment, as though he were describing routine steps in a daily task rather than acts of horror. Psychologists found traits in Dahmer that had existed long before adulthood: extreme social isolation, lack of empathy, intense fantasies, chronic detachment, and a broken emotional framework. These signs had been present for years, long before the killings began. They were part of him, built into him, growing quietly beneath the surface. At trial, Dahmer pled guilty but insane. The court rejected the insanity claim, ruling that he understood right from wrong, and he was sentenced to multiple life terms. In prison, Dahmer became a reserved, almost ghost-like presence. He read, he worked quietly, he occasionally expressed regret, though experts continued to debate whether that regret was rooted in empathy or simply in shame. In November of 1994, Dahmer was attacked and killed by another inmate. His death closed the chapter, but not the questions. His case remains one of the most studied in modern history, not only because of the brutality of his crimes, but because of the emptiness inside him, an emptiness visible long before the world knew his name. And when the echoes of Milwaukee fade into silence, another figure steps out from the long stretch of North American highways, a man whose violence traveled with him from state to state, each crime marked not by silence, but by a chilling smile. September of 1990. A stretch of highway outside Taos, New Mexico. Dawn creeps in slowly, spreading pale light across the desert floor. A single tractor trailer rolls along the empty road, its engine humming against the stillness. The driver inside grips the wheel with calm familiarity. But behind his steady eyes, a storm has been waiting for years. That driver is Keith Hunter Jesperson. To understand what he would become, we return to the 1950s, to rural British Columbia, where a boy far larger than his classmates walked the schoolyard with a heavy, quiet unease. Jesperson grew up surrounded by farmland, isolation, and a father whose discipline often became violent. But beyond any hardship, something else was growing inside him. Something darker than fear, darker than anger. Even as a child, Jesperson's behavior revealed troubling patterns. He harmed animals, not out of impulse, but experimentation. He held them down. He watched them struggle. He wanted to understand power and how easily life could be taken away. Psychologists would later point to these acts as early markers, signs that the empathy most children develop simply never took root in him. Jesperson did not learn to feel for others. He learned to hide what he felt. School years offered little relief. He was bullied for his size, mocked for his awkwardness, ignored by the people he wished would see him. Loneliness hardened into resentment, resentment twisted into fantasy, and fantasy began to fill the silence of his life. Jesperson reached adulthood still searching for a place where he felt in control. He married young, had children, and appeared to settle into an ordinary life. But beneath that surface, the fantasies sharpened. He imagined domination. He imagined violence. He imagined the thrill of watching someone depend on him, and then watching them fail. Driving long-haul trucks became his escape. The open road gave him distance. Anonymous faces passed him every day. No one asked questions. No one knew his name, and no one saw the darkness forming. His first known murder occurred in the early 1990s. A woman he claimed mocked him, triggering years of buried humiliation. But that explanation was only a fragment of the truth. The real motive lived in the fantasies he had been feeding since childhood. He strangled her with his bare hands, feeling control rise inside him like a tide. Later, he said the moment felt quiet, almost peaceful. Jesperson had discovered something that would redefine him: the rush of absolute control. He targeted women who lived transient lives, women on the margins, women who trusted too easily or had nowhere else to go. He met them in bars, at truck stops, along the roadside. His size and calm voice made him seem safe. And once they were alone, he used the same method again and again: strangulation. A method that required closeness, strength, and intention. It was intimate, it was personal, and it was exactly what he wanted. But what makes Jesperson's story truly disturbing is not only the violence, but the signature he chose to leave behind. After his first murders, 2 innocent people were wrongfully charged with a crime he had committed. Their false confessions spread through newspapers, radio, and nightly news broadcasts. Jesperson watched, outraged, not that he had killed, but that someone else was receiving attention for his work. So, he left a message, a confession written on a restroom wall, signed with a simple smiley face. He liked how it looked. He liked how it felt. He liked the idea of journalists and detectives reading that symbol and wondering about the man behind it. Soon after, he sent letters to newspapers, long, rambling, boastful letters written in his unmistakable handwriting. He described murders in detail. He taunted police. He signed each letter the same way, a smiling face drawn beneath his words. The Happy Face Killer, a name he chose for himself. His need for recognition became his undoing. Investigators followed the letters. They traced his movements. They connected cases that had seemed unrelated. Eventually, Jesperson was arrested, and behind closed doors, the calm voice returned. He confessed freely. He spoke with the same detached tone he had used as a child when explaining why he hurt animals. He even claimed additional victims, some proven, some doubtful, each described with eerie comfort. Psychologists studying Jesperson found the same pattern that had followed him from childhood: lack of empathy, compulsive domination, emotional detachment, and a lifelong hunger for recognition. These traits were not shaped by a single event. They were woven into him from the beginning. He was sentenced to life in prison. There, he continues to write letters, continues to tell stories, continues to shape his legacy with the same chilling purpose that once guided his hands. For investigators, Jesperson represents a specific kind of darkness, the kind that grows quietly, unnoticed, in the corners of a life that seems unremarkable, until it is too late. And as the long highway finally empties of Jesperson's shadow, another landscape takes its place. Not a road this time, but a muddy farm on the outskirts of Vancouver, where missing women vanished into the night, and the ground itself hid secrets no one wanted to imagine. February of 2002. Port Coquitlam, British Columbia. Rain sweeps across a stretch of farm road, turning the dirt to thick, heavy mud. Police cruisers sit quietly outside a rundown pig farm, their headlights cutting thin beams through the mist. Officers move slowly across the property, boots sinking into the wet ground. No one speaks. No one needs to. Everyone senses the truth buried somewhere in the shadows of this place. This is the home of Robert William Pickton. To understand how this farm became one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Canadian history, we must look back to the 1950s, to a childhood shaped by isolation, hardship, and the quiet decay of a family struggling to maintain control of their land. Pickton grew up on the same farm that would later make headlines around the world. The environment was chaotic. The buildings were rusted and collapsing. Animals roamed freely across the yard. His parents were strict, unyielding, and emotionally distant. Neighbors described the family as strange, withdrawn, and fiercely private. From an early age, Robert Pickton learned to operate in silence, not because he was taught to, but because silence was the only constant around him. He struggled academically, he struggled socially, he rarely spoke unless spoken to. And while isolation alone does not create a killer, it shaped the contours of his inner world, a world where empathy remained distant and human connection felt foreign. As an adult, Pickton and his siblings inherited the family farm. While his brother maintained other business ventures, Robert became the primary caretaker of the property. Over time, It deteriorated into a maze of cluttered sheds, abandoned vehicles, containers, and animal pens. The farm became a place where secrecy thrived, where people could come and go without being noticed, where noise was common enough to mask anything unusual, and where the remoteness provided a perfect cover. In the 1980s and 1990s, women began disappearing from Vancouver's downtown east side, a community marked by poverty, addiction, and vulnerability. Many of the missing were Indigenous women. Families raised alarms, but authorities initially struggled to connect the disappearances. There were so few leads, so few witnesses, so few answers. Meanwhile, the pig farm hosted parties, gatherings, and visitors who drifted through without knowing the full truth of what lay just out of sight. Pickton often visited the downtown east side. He offered rides, he offered shelter, he offered money. He blended into the background, an unremarkable figure few looked at twice. But the women he targeted rarely returned. Rumors swirled around the community long before police took substantial action. Stories of strange behavior, stories of women visiting the farm and never coming back. Stories no one wanted to believe. The idea was too horrifying, too unthinkable, too monstrous. Yet the truth remained. The break in the case came in 2002, when police executed a warrant on the property for unrelated weapons charges. What they found triggered one of the largest forensic investigations in Canadian history. Tools, clothing, personal belongings, remains. The farm, soaked in mud and decay, hid evidence everywhere, across buildings, inside freezers, buried beneath soil, scattered among debris. It took years for investigators to process the site. Anthropologists, forensic experts, and specialized teams sifted through thousands of pieces of evidence. The complexity was staggering, the scale was overwhelming, the sorrow was immeasurable. Pickton eventually confessed to an undercover officer that he had planned to kill even more women, a chilling admission that left investigators certain his crimes extended far beyond what they could definitively prove. He was charged with multiple counts of murder. The trial was long, meticulous, and emotionally devastating for families who had spent years searching for answers. Evidence presented in court revealed a pattern of predation targeting some of society's most vulnerable women. Throughout the proceedings, Pickton remained disturbingly calm, expressionless, quiet, and detached, as though the violence described had no connection to him at all. No remorse, no emotion. Only a blankness that unsettled even seasoned investigators. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The Pickton case remains a national wound in Canada, a tragedy that exposed systemic failures, brought attention to missing Indigenous women, and forced an entire country to confront the reality of predators who hide in plain sight. Psychologists later noted that Pickton displayed traits consistent with lifelong emotional detachment, a pattern present long before any murder was committed, a lack of connection, a void where empathy should have been, a familiarity with death that came from years of slaughtering animals, and eventually something far worse. The farm still stands in the public imagination as a symbol of darkness, a reminder that some places hide secrets so deep the land itself seems to hold its breath. And as the mud on the Pickton farm settles, we shift thousands of miles away to the warm streets of Columbia, where another predator moves silently through crowded neighborhoods, leaving behind a trail of young victims and a legacy of grief unlike anything the world had seen before. April of 1999, Pereira, Colombia. Morning sunlight stretches across a grassy hillside as investigators move slowly through a patch of open land. Their boots sink into the damp soil. Children from a nearby village watch from a distance, whispering to one another. And in the stillness of that field, beneath a thin layer of earth, officers uncover the remains of yet another young boy. It is here, in this quiet valley, that a nightmare finally begins to reveal its true size. The man responsible is Luis Alfredo Garavito. To understand how he became one of the most prolific child killers ever recorded, we return to the 1960s, to a childhood scarred by violence and fear in a small Colombian town struggling with poverty and instability. Garavito grew up in a home marked by severe abuse. He endured emotional, physical, and sexual trauma that left deep psychological wounds. But what made him different was not only the suffering he experienced, It was the way he internalized it. Early signs of a fractured mind began to appear. He was manipulative. He lied effortlessly. He bullied younger children. He displayed uncontrollable anger. He expressed violent fantasies long before he reached adulthood. Garavito sought control in the only way he knew, by dominating those who were smaller, weaker, or easier to manipulate. By his teenage years, he drifted between temporary jobs and unstable relationships. He drank heavily. He erupted in sudden fits of rage. And behind his public face, the face of a man who claimed to love children. He nurtured dark fantasies that would soon define him. In the 1990s, Colombia was a country overwhelmed by conflict, poverty, and displacement. Thousands of children roamed the streets unsupervised, hungry, and searching for help wherever they could find it. Garavito understood their vulnerability. He understood their trust. He understood the cracks in society that allowed predators to hide in plain sight. And he used all of it. Garavito approached children while disguised, sometimes as a vendor, sometimes as a monk, sometimes as a teacher or charity worker. His disguises were chosen carefully, always matching the environment, always ensuring that children lowered their guard. He offered them treats. He offered them work. He offered them comfort. And once he gained their trust, he led them to isolated areas, fields, hillsides, abandoned structures, patches of forest beyond the edges of towns. What happened next was brutal. Garavito restrained, assaulted, and murdered the children, often leaving their bodies scattered across rural areas. The violence was extreme, far beyond what investigators initially imagined. For years, the cases went unnoticed as part of a larger pattern. Children went missing frequently, records were inconsistent, families moved often, many victims had no documentation at all. Authorities did not realize they were hunting a single predator, not until bodies with similar injuries began appearing across multiple regions. Patterns emerged, a method became visible, and whispers began circulating among investigators that Colombia might be facing something unprecedented. The break in the case came when police found a pair of glasses near one of the scenes, glasses that could not have belonged to a child. The prescription was traced back to an optometrist. The optometrist traced it back to a man who used false names. That man was Garavito. When he was finally arrested, he attempted to deny everything. But as evidence mounted, he began to talk, first reluctantly, then with disturbing detail. He guided investigators to burial sites. He described how he chose his victims. He explained his methods, his motives, his fantasies, and he did so calmly. According to investigators, Garavito displayed an unsettling mixture of remorse and pride. He cried at times, claiming he wanted forgiveness, yet described his crimes with precision and memory that revealed how deeply he had been shaped by the darkness within him. Psychologists who examined him noted deep-seated personality disorders, a lack of empathy, extreme manipulation, compulsive lying, and violent sexual compulsions. These traits were present early in life, long before his first known crime. The abuse he suffered may have shaped the direction of his violence, but the internal fractures existed long before he ever acted on them. Garavito eventually confessed to numerous murders, though the true number of victims remains uncertain. The confirmed cases alone marked him as one of the most prolific killers in modern history. The sentencing reflected the gravity of the crimes, though Colombian law limited the punishment available at the time. Even so, Garavito remains incarcerated, monitored closely, and widely considered one of the most dangerous offenders ever recorded. For Colombia, his crimes left a scar that has never fully healed, a reminder of the vulnerability of children, the failures of systems meant to protect them, and the unimaginable cruelty that can grow quietly inside a single human being. And as the fields of Colombia fall behind us, we travel far north, to the cold forests of Alaska, where a soft-spoken man lived an orderly life by day and plotted meticulous acts of violence by night. A man whose darkness was not chaotic, but organized with chilling precision.
Now,
You do what you're doing right now.
which is what?
Interrogating me.
No.
Interviewing.
March of 2012, Anchorage, Alaska. A pale morning light spreads across the snow-covered parking lot of a small coffee stand. Police tape flutters in the cold wind. Officers move quietly between vehicles, their breath rising in frozen clouds. A young barista has vanished without explanation, and the empty stand feels colder than the air around it. No one yet knows that the man responsible is already far away, watching the investigation unfold with the calm detachment of someone who has rehearsed this moment his entire life. His name is Israel Keyes. To understand the depth of his darkness, we step back into the 1980s, to rural Washington state, where Keyes grew up in a strict, isolated family. Electricity was limited. Contact with other children was rare. His parents avoided mainstream society, and their beliefs kept the family far from schools and community life. But isolation did not create the monster Keyes became. It simply gave him room to grow. As a child, he displayed disturbing traits: cruelty toward animals, fascination with weapons, and intense curiosity about control and pain. Neighbors would later recall that Keyes watched others with an eerie stillness, as though memorizing their routines, studying their behavior, calculating something beneath the surface. By adolescence, he had already begun to separate himself from the world emotionally. He rejected the beliefs of his family, grew resentful, turned inward. He later said he felt different, not in a way he could explain, but in a way that made him believe rules did not apply to him. He joined the military in the late 1990s, serving quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention. He was well-liked, disciplined, calm. No one imagined that beneath the uniform was a predator perfecting his method. When Keyes returned to civilian life, he created a double existence. One part contractor and father, the other part meticulous hunter. He traveled across the United States frequently, not for sightseeing, but for reconnaissance. He studied towns, walked trails, memorized the flow of strangers in unfamiliar cities. And then he began to prepare. Keyes buried what he called kill kits across the country, buckets filled with weapons, restraints, and tools. He stored them in forests, parks, and remote areas, sometimes years before choosing a victim. Each kit represented not an impulse, but a plan, a decision, a promise to himself. He hunted with patience. He watched homes for days at a time. He learned his victims' schedules. He preferred strangers, people with no connection to his life, no pattern that could be traced back to him. His crimes stretched across multiple states, each attack separated by long periods of silence. Keyes took pride in avoiding patterns. He avoided impulsive violence. Everything was planned. Everything was controlled. In 2012, he abducted an Anchorage barista named Samantha Koenig, a crime that finally exposed him. He kept her captive, manipulated the situation to mislead investigators, and fled the state. But this time, his precision slipped. Keyes used an ATM card belonging to the victim's family, triggering surveillance footage and banking alerts across several states. Texas police eventually stopped the car. Inside, they found masks, weapons, and the unmistakable signs of a man who had lived a double life for years. Once in custody, Keyes revealed far more than investigators expected. He confessed, not with remorse, but with a strange mixture of pride and irritation. He wanted to control the story. He wanted to choose what was revealed and what remained hidden. He described his crimes in calm, methodical detail, explaining how he selected victims, how he traveled to avoid detection, how he buried kits long before he ever used them. Detectives quickly realized they were dealing with something uniquely chilling, a killer who had no clear psychological pattern, no predictable signature, and no emotional reaction. Keyes killed not out of rage or trauma, but out of desire for dominance, desire for control, desire for the thrill of planning and execution. He spoke about murder the way someone might describe a hobby, something practiced, perfected, enjoyed. Experts who studied him noted traits visible long before adulthood: lack of empathy, emotional detachment, strong manipulative intelligence, and an obsessive need for control. These traits formed early. They shaped him before his military service, before his travels, before his carefully orchestrated crimes. The true number of Keyes' victims remains unknown. He hinted at bodies buried across the country, some in lakes, some in forests, some in places only he would ever recognize. He gave investigators fragments of stories, then withheld the rest. He enjoyed watching them search in the dark. In December of 2012, before revealing everything he knew, Israel Keyes ended his own life in his jail cell. He left behind drawings, crude, violent sketches, and a note filled with poetic ramblings, none of which offered real answers. His death closed the investigation, but not the mysteries. To this day, families, detectives, and entire communities still wonder how many victims he left behind, and how deeply his shadow stretches across the map of the United States. Keyes remains one of the most chilling examples of a predator who operated not from chaos, but from order, not from impulse, but calculation, not from trauma, but something far more intrinsic, a mind shaped by cold emptiness, a man born to plan, to deceive, and to dominate. And as the cold wilderness of Alaska fades into darkness, another kind of predator emerges, not the hunter of forests or highways, but a man who built his identity from mirrors, cameras, and carefully crafted illusions. May of 2012, Montreal, Quebec. A small, dimly lit apartment sits on the second floor of an old building off Descaries Boulevard. The hallway outside is silent except for the buzzing of fluorescent lights. Behind one of the doors, a camera's red recording light blinks steadily, waiting. The room is still. The smell of chemicals hangs in the air, and a man stands before the camera, adjusting his hair with slow, deliberate movements. This is Luka Magnotta, a man whose need to be seen was as dangerous as the darkness growing inside him. To understand how he reached this moment, beneath the glow of that recording light, we must return to the 1980s, to a childhood marked by instability, neglect, and a sense of disconnection that followed him into adulthood. Magnotta was born Eric Clinton Newman in Ontario. He grew up in a turbulent household. His parents struggled to maintain stability. He moved often, shifting between schools, relatives, and temporary homes. And throughout it all, he learned early that attention, even negative attention, gave him something he could not find anywhere else: identity. As a child, Magnotta was quiet, withdrawn, socially anxious. He spent long hours alone. He fixated on mirrors. He obsessed over appearance. He struggled to understand himself without the reflection he created. By his teenage years, he had begun crafting personas, delicate masks stitched together from movies, magazines, and fantasies of fame. He told stories about himself that shifted constantly. He lied easily. He invented histories. He reinvented his name. Nothing inside him felt solid, so he tried to build himself from the outside in. In adulthood, Magnotta drifted into the fringes of the modeling world. He created portfolios filled with edited photos. He reached out to journalists insisting he was being stalked. He auditioned for reality shows. He wrote his own Wikipedia articles. It did not matter if the attention was real or fabricated. It only mattered that someone was looking. But beneath the masks, another impulse grew. One that began not with humans, but with animals. Videos surfaced online of a young man harming cats, his face partially hidden. The internet responded with outrage, launching amateur investigations that drew international attention. Message boards lit up with accusations. Groups traced his movements across continents. Reporters sought him out. And Magnotta reveled in it. For the first time, thousands of strangers were speaking his name. He had become the center of a story. A villain, yes, but a visible one. Visibility was all he ever wanted. By 2012, Magnotta had left Canada and returned again, moving through hotels, apartments, and online personas. His fantasies evolved. The need for attention intensified, and the boundary between performance and reality began to blur. What happened next would horrify the world. In late May of that year, Magnotta lured an international student, Jun Lin, to his Montreal apartment. Inside, he prepared the room as though setting a stage. He placed the camera carefully. He staged props. He created the setting for a performance that would forever mark his name in infamy. The crime was brutal, it was methodical, and it was recorded. Days later, a package containing human remains arrived at the headquarters of a political party in Ottawa. Another package was sent to a school. Police traced the origin to Montreal, and when they entered Magnotta's apartment, they found a scene that confirmed their worst fears: blood, tools, and a bed frame that had been moved beneath the camera's perspective. Magnotta, however, was already gone. He fled to Paris, then to Berlin, slipping across borders with the same performative flourish he applied to every part of his life. international authorities launched a massive manhunt, circulating his images across airports, train stations, and online networks. Ironically, it was the very thing he craved, recognition, that led to his downfall. Inside a Berlin internet cafe, Magnotta sat at a computer reading articles about himself. The clerk recognized him. Police were called. Moments later, officers surrounded the cafe and arrested him without incident. When interrogated, Magnotta slipped between personas, confident one moment, timid the next, then entirely detached. He spoke of conspiracies, he shifted blame, he hinted at voices, he tried to control the narrative as he had controlled the camera in his apartment. Experts analyzing him found a complex blend of psychological traits: deep narcissism, identity disorder, manipulative tendencies, and an aching need for validation that seemed to stretch back to childhood. These traits did not explain away his cruelty, but they formed the scaffolding that held his darkness in place. Magnotta was extradited to Canada, where he stood trial for first-degree murder. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses, digital records, and the video itself painted a disturbing picture of a man who treated violence as performance. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. In the aftermath, one truth became clear. Luka Magnotta was not a killer shaped solely by circumstance. He was a man shaped by an emptiness so profound that he tried to fill it with attention, with personas, with lies, with cruelty, with spectacle. A man who wanted the world to look at him, no matter the cost. And as the cameras fade on Magnotta's manufactured image, another figure emerges, quieter, softer spoken, and far less theatrical, yet driven by a predatory hunger just as cold. June of 2014. Barking, East London. A thin dawn mist settles over St. Margaret's churchyard as the early morning light glints across wet stone. The streets are quiet. A single jogger passes the church gate, noticing something unusual near the base of the old stone wall. A young man lying still in the damp grass. Police arrive minutes later. They see no signs of struggle, no signs of violence, just a body, silent and alone in the first pale light of morning. It will not be the last. The man responsible for these scenes is Stephen Port, a quiet chef, a neighbor, a man who appeared harmless, until the truth revealed something far more sinister. To understand how Port became one of Britain's most chilling modern predators, we return to the 1970s, to Southend-on-Sea, where he grew up shy, introverted, and emotionally distant. Teachers described him as quiet and isolated. Classmates found him odd, difficult to connect with, seemingly lost in his own world. Even as a child, he struggled to express emotions. He avoided eye contact. He drifted through classrooms like a ghost. By adolescence, Port's sense of self had fractured further. He lied easily about small things, inventing stories about his life, his background, and his abilities. These lies were not crafted to impress. They were crafted to replace who he really was. He had no stable identity, no solid ground beneath him. And in that emptiness, deception came naturally. As an adult, Port worked various jobs before becoming a chef. He lived a quiet life, blending into the background of Barking's busy streets. His neighbors found him polite but strange, a man who rarely joined conversations, rarely made eye contact, and often wandered the neighborhood at odd hours. He lived alone in a small flat not far from the churchyard, the perfect place for someone who wanted to operate unseen. In the early 2000s, Port began using dating sites and applications. He created multiple profiles, each with slight variations of his personality. Some made him appear shy, some made him appear confident, some made him appear successful, but none of them were real. What Port wanted was not connection. He wanted control. Soon he began meeting men in person. Young men, many from vulnerable backgrounds, some new to the city, some trusting of someone older and seemingly stable. Port invited them to his flat, offering drinks, conversation, and reassurance. But behind the calm exterior, he had planned something far darker. Port began drugging men with GHB, a substance that removes resistance, erases memory, and leaves victims helpless. He assaulted them, filmed them, and in a number of cases, administered doses so strong that the victims never woke up. Then came the churchyard. One morning, a passerby found the body of Anthony Walgate, a young fashion student. Port had panicked after the death, dragging the body outside and calling emergency services with a fabricated story, claiming he had simply found the man collapsed. Police questioned him. He lied. His lies were inconsistent, but not enough to raise the alarm. Weeks later, another young man, Gabriel Kovary, was found, propped against the same wall. Then a third, Daniel Whitworth, all within meters of one another. And still, the deaths were treated as isolated tragedies, accidents, misadventures, coincidences. What investigators did not yet see was the quiet predator living just steps away, moving bodies under cover of night, trying to erase his involvement, relying on the vulnerability of his victims and the assumptions of those around him. Port operated with a mixture of cold planning and emotional emptiness. He did not fit the image of a violent killer. He was soft-spoken, he seemed harmless. He worked quietly in kitchens and walked the same streets as everyone else. His neighbors never imagined he was the reason bodies kept appearing by the church wall. The turning point came when families began raising questions. Their sons had no history of substance abuse, no reason to be in that churchyard, no explanation for their sudden deaths. Pressure grew, information surfaced, and investigators finally began to connect the patterns. Test results revealed the presence of GHB. Phone records traced victims back to Port's flat. Inaccuracies in his statements became undeniable. Under scrutiny, Port's facade crumbled. He was arrested in 2015, charged with multiple murders, sexual assaults, and administration of harmful substances. During interrogation, he remained detached, offering vague explanations, shifting blame, showing no visible remorse. To psychologists, his emotional blankness was unmistakable. To prosecutors, his intentions were clear. He exploited trust, manipulated vulnerability, and operated with cold precision. The trial exposed the full scope of his actions: false stories, staged scenes, repeated lies to authorities, and deliberate targeting of victims who were less likely to be believed. It was cruelty calculated in silence. Port was sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order, ensuring he will never leave custody. But the shadow he left behind extends far beyond his prison cell. In Barking, the churchyard stands as a quiet reminder of lives taken too early. In London, the case sparked major investigations into systemic failures. For families, the grief remains unending. Stephen Port was not a man who erupted in violence. He was a man who hid his darkness behind a quiet exterior, a predator who watched the world through a blank gaze, choosing his victims with deliberate intent. And as the last echoes of Barking fall into silence, we step back from each of these stories, from every date, every street, every place where darkness took root. 10 men, 10 paths shaped by emptiness, cruelty, and cold intent. And before we close this chapter, there is one question left to ask. As these stories come to an end, and the shadows of every quiet street and lonely room fade into silence, we are left with a truth that is difficult to ignore. Darkness does not always arrive with warning, and the most dangerous, people are often the ones who blend in so easily. Before we step away from this journey, if you want more stories told in this calm, unflinching light, if you want to keep exploring the cases others are afraid to speak about, make sure you subscribe. Your support keeps this channel alive, and it helps bring these hidden histories into the open. And while you take a breath, tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Because every place, every city, every quiet corner has its own shadows, and its own stories waiting to be told. These 10 men showed us different faces of evil. Some chased attention, some moved silently, some planned with precision, others acted out of pure compulsion. But all of them remind us how thin the line can be between the ordinary world we trust and the darkness that hides beneath it. Thank you for walking through this with me. Stay safe, stay curious, and until the next story, keep your eyes open.